or is missing. Do we have closing government?
Closing government is here.
And do we have closing opposition? Do we have closing opposition in the room?
Opposition is here.
All right, great. Let me just get all. Okay, amazing. So in the meantime, I'd like to request teams to paste, just type down their speaking positions in the chat space, and yep, just get that in the team name as well, quickly. Thank you. Okay, so I'm not sure what's going on with opening opposition. So they'll be joining shortly. I see closing government posted, opening government, closing opposition. Can I just get your speaking positions as well in the chat space quickly? Do we have opening opposition on the call now?
Yep, we're in the call now. Sorry for keeping y'all waiting. We're here. Let's go.
Okay, it's all right. And I just want to confirm if your speaking positions are now in the chat space. Thank you so much.
Yeah, I'm typing that out for you right away.
All right, amazing. I think all teams have done due diligence, and if there is nothing else, I'd like to call the House to order and invite the Prime Minister to deliver the speech. Yeah. Also, for the purposes of timing, I would appreciate if you could time yourself, because I'll be focusing on notes and calling guys out. Thank you.
Hi, PM. Give me a minute to drink water and then we'll start. Hi, my name is Kelvin, pronouns he, they, POIs through voice. I will call for a POI. You don't have to badger me. I'll actually just call for a POI. Starting my speech in three, two, one. We say then that the ability to be able to pay back loans is bleak in nature for these developing countries. The ability to pipeline, to push for reasoning and diplomatic approaches to remedy your loan burden happens only in OG, and it's where we already win and clean share. But sure, what is haircut in economic terminology? Say I'm able to loan $10 from someone, but because I cannot pay it back, the amount asked for collateral or for paying back is then lessened in interest. So instead of 10 pesos, it has a haircut of 20% or $10, I mean. It has a haircut of 20%, so I pay $8 at the very end of the day. That's how this haircut system works. A measure to lower the collateral value of an item based off of lower than the normal asset value of an item or loan. This means three things for OG. Number one, it already then provides leverage towards being able to pay back loans less for these developing states at the very end of the day. I'll tell you why it is beneficial later. But number two, it removes the economic burden placed onto them by lowering that requirement coming from OG and only OG alone. But lastly, it also does not affect your credit score because this is bargaining at the very end of the day. It's something in consensus from both of these loaners and from both of these people who are in debt. This is a form of debt restructuring anyway, since you're still restructuring your debt by negotiating with your creditors to lower the value of your debt. But sure, I say then, up my posit that asking and aggressively pushing for haircuts is unlikely given the inherent profit incentive of a lot of debtors. Three reasons why we were able to remove this coming from OG. On OG, we aggressively push for haircuts as opposed to other methods like defaulting, and we believe that this is the best case for all these developing countries. In number two, we disallow other methods of debt reduction except for haircuts and focus extensively on negotiating for haircuts. It is an opposition where the bargaining chip to lower down the collateral value coming from their side is worse because you have alternatives such as defaulting that they're able to skirt to. Why is this more likely of skirting to defaulting better and are more likely in opposition? Because notice that defaulting and other forms that affect the credit literally affect the credit score of the country in terms of debt. Because then your debt history builds up in a lot of these debt collector companies that you resort to in paying and will record your credit score and talk about your delinquency in paying at the very end of the day. Notice how this is extremely harmful because the comparative is better under OG, where you're able to try to negotiate for lower collateral value. It makes it a willing situation for the loaner company, so your credit score isn't affected, and the lower collateral value actually makes you be able to actually pay it better. Meaning then, the proximity of being able to pay in debt is worse on O or CO because number one, your credit score is recorded by banks and thus you makes you already a preset to unpalatability by a lot of loaners or investors at the very end of the day. This means number one, at a time of urgency as a developing country, you aren't able to pay those loans anyway because it's too big, but now you're unpalatable to future loans and investors, and your economy goes to shambles because of the fact that you're not able to operate your economy at the very end of the day. The comparative is better in OT because at least we concentrate forces on negotiating for haircuts. Why is this better? Three reasons. Number one, this becomes effective as there's no alternative the developing country will accept other than haircuts, meaning that if the loaner country was so desperate to gain their payback, they would have to negotiate with their lending country or in-debt country. Number two, this is true because loaner rights disallow defaulting when not consented to by the debtor unless stated in the contract that it's allowed to. Number three, what happens is when you concentrate efforts negotiating for a haircut, you gain not only more leverage in loaning as a developing nation, but you also have the ability to bargain against their loaners with that leverage and bargaining chip. Even if for some reason that they will not concede to a haircut, which is worst case, the comparative that they probably will push for to regain those funds anyway is to be able to resort to sanctions. But comparatively, they'll not regain those sanctions their funds anyway by pushing for sanctions. Because what happens is these sanctions become a reactionary measure and still happen to affect them because now it is sure these developing countries are not able to pay back these loans. Even in the worst case where sanctions will happen in RC because they're not able to actually concede to let's say for example like haircut at the very end of the day because they're not negotiating. We say on our side, sanctions are okay and much better in a comparative, which is a worst case compared to opposition side, where defaulting will cause economic sanctioning anyway because of the credit score ultimately barring you from loans and your credit score ultimately making investors pull out from you because of your economic delinquency as recorded in a lot of banks. So not only then, coming from opening opposition or closing opposition, are you sanctioned in the worst case where you still cannot pay it back to a lot of these let's say for example government systems or a lot of these other countries at the very end of the day because you cannot negotiate for lower prices, meaning that you're never able to actually guarantee that ROI, but you also then lose opt-in for the external economy to find you reliable because you're low in credit score. Because frankly, in a lot of banks, you're going to be delinquent or you're going to be, let's say, for example, someone who doesn't actually coincide with a lot of these investor or debt follow-ups at the very end of the day. But notice that even on the prospect of donors, that's going to be beneficial. Because in terms of ROI, at least you're able to regain that sustainable ROI better in OG because even if it is less than the price of loan you provided, realize then that at least that still in fact increased by interest per interval anytime soon. So it's probably higher than the loan at the very end, higher than the entire the very end of the day. We say probably they'll pay the same value as its base asset value, so we're able to actually remove that incentive for interest that comes from the loans that literally makes it more that literally makes a lot of these developing countries push to be more exploited by a lot of these like big I know big like loaner countries at the very end of the day. But sure, even if it's lower in value, or even if they're going to be lower in value, at least the haircut is then a negotiation, and that negotiation guarantees the necessary collateral value that the developing country can pay at the very end of the day. Because we have to note that coming from O or CO, if this developing country cannot literally pay their debt at the very end of the day, then probably they're never able to pay the debt anyway, because coming from their side, we have the lack of negotiation that's able to push for a lowering of their collateral value to be able to actually pay back their loans at the very end of the day. But sure, I'll take up POI. Three.
Yeah,
We
listen,
want to
here's a
cite
question.
to prove
Wait,
that debt restructuring is way better off than haircuts. I think we would want you guys to engage in that contest here.
wait. You guys both POI at the same time. I'll take CO. Say it again.
All right. So our clear comparative from closing opposition is that restructuring more often is much more effective than haircuts, and that is why we wouldn't want you to like developing nations to buy into that. So just for fair engagement, you can start engaging it from Prime Minister.
Debt trapping or all these mechanisms that a lot of these like loaner companies, loaner countries do. I still don't get why this is going to be solved coming from your side at the very end of the day, because you're still opting in a lot of loans anyways, so you're still going to be debt trapped either way. But maybe I just heard you wrong because your mic was kind of weird. But sure, even if in the very case where you're able to actually push for the incentive to solve debt traps in a lot of these big countries, or a lot of these countries who are pushing to loan you at the very end of the day, notice the comparative is at least better on our side, because the debt trap doesn't force you to be able to actually pay full debt increased with interest at the very end of the day, because you're still able to negotiate for all of these. Let's say, for example, for the ability to lower the collateral value that you're going to use to be able to pay back a lot of these loans, because of the fact that you're able to actually push for haircuts at the very end of the day. This means then that the ability to be able to actually leverage this country is better coming from open government, because at least we're able to actually push for the negotiations that none of the other houses is able to actually push for at the very end of the day. For all those reasons, I'm proud to propose.
Would like to thank the speaker for that fine speech. We'll call upon the leader of opposition.
Yeah, can you guys hear me? Am I audible enough?
Yep.
Perfect. POI is in the chat. I'll start with you soon. Okay, yeah, sure. So I'm gonna start in 3, 2, 1. So cool. Here are 3 flaws in the opening government case. The first one is that they don't explain fairly to you what the alternatives are, because we think fairly today's debate is if they say that that's
I'm
haircut
sorry,
is
speaker, you're breaking. Hello?
how the other things that Infos like told you.
Hello? Hi. Mhm. Hello, I'm unable to hear you.
So they want
Nana, you're breaking a lot, so I'm unable to hear your speech.
to
Could the partner ask him to reconnect or something?
Hey, Nana, you're breaking. Nana,
extend the
can you
years to
pause?
20
Can you pause?
Could you,
Nana,
could you text him? Could you text him and tell him that like we can't hear him?
back.
Please just text him and get back to us quickly.
People that
Hi, we're still unable to hear
from
you if you're speaking.
you cannot hear me.
Yeah, you're breaking a lot, so some bits and pieces of your speeches are just really like inaudible.
Um. All right.
Could you
Hold up.
just
Let me just.
say a full sentence, perhaps, just to confirm if I can get that, or maybe just with the motion or something, just to confirm if we can hear you.
Okay. This house believes that governments of developing nations with high national or sovereign debt should aggressively pursue haircuts as opposed to other debt options, including but not limited to defaulting, debt restructuring, etc. Was that better?
Yeah. Amazing. Yeah, that's fine. When we are ready.
So then I'm gonna have to reach that.
Yep.
Okay, it's fine. All right, I would hit the restart button. That's fine. Okay. Um, I'm gonna restart in three, two, one. Cool. We think there are three flaws in the opening government case. The first one is that they only explain to you what the info slide says. If you're gonna pay someone $1 billion, you just cut it off and you pay them $700 million, for example, because you claim you're in crisis, right? The other options that we could do, for example, on side opposition, is things like debt restructuring, where what you do is that you sit down with the people that lent you the money and you renegotiate to extend the payments period, for example, or you can also reduce the interest rate. But at the end of the day, you still pay them the exact principal that they loaned you. So if they give you $1 billion, you're going to pay them $1 billion, maybe with only 10% interest or maybe only 15% interest, but they will agree to it, right? And period of time, but you're still going to pay them exactly what you ought to pay them. Granted, debt restructuring does not in any way, cut short the debt burden that is on a developing nation. That is the burden that we're going to defend from side on side gov, is to defend why these developing nations need to quickly cut off the debt burden that they have on themselves without, showing you any mechanisms how they can weather the negative repercussions that would come out of that. So I'm going to give you two cases, right? The first case is going to be about how you need to maintain trust between you as a developing nation and the other bodies that grant you loans, be it another country or be it even your own internal citizens that bought your bonds, or be it the IMF and whatnot. You need to keep that level of trust with them. So under no circumstance should you pursue a debt haircut. But the second thing we're going to talk about is how the worst case scenario for us, right? If we restructure the debt and we're still unable to pay, how the worst case scenario, which is bankruptcy or loan defaultment, is even better for a developing nation. Let's get to it, right? But no, we think the concept of loans and international financial systems is premised largely upon trust. If the IMF gives you $500 million to help you rejuvenate your economy after COVID, is because they're trusting you to do a lot of sensible things with it, and they're trusting you to come back to them to pay them. They're also trusting you, secondly, that if anything happens to the point that you cannot pay as a nation, you will come to them and you will sit them at a table and you will negotiate with them better terms of loan repayment. That is the only thing that you can do if you decide to pursue debt restructuring. Why? Because of two things. Because of one, how debt restructuring takes into consideration the consent of the person that gave you the loan. For you to be able to restructure a debt, obviously you have to go back to the person that gave it to you. So it's either they agreed to take a reduced interest rate or they agreed to extend the duration that they have to pay. But in all instances, they agree and they know they're going to get back their you're going to get back their principal, right? Why is this trust better protected and why is it crucial in our world? It's crucial for two reasons. The first one is that it guarantees that after you're done paying that loan, or even after you're done paying a bigger portion of that loan, those people would be happy to give you other loans. Do you know why this is crucial? Because like these developing nations need loans upon loans. Like they always need loans and they always need assistance. The last thing you want to do is piss off the IMF because they give you $1 billion, but you decided by your own national policy you are giving a haircut to them and you pay them 700 million. Or you tell China, I know I took $1 million from you, but I'm gonna pay you 700 grand. They're gonna get pissed off at you next time. You are not going to get a loan. So what that means then is that the short-term patch that OG gives to their world and economy will be leaking in the end. Let's say you take a haircut in 2024. You're gonna just write off all your debts because you paid half the amount and now you don't owe anybody. But come 2025, insofar as you're a developing nation and like your economy is that terrible, you will need to go for another loan. You cannot go back to China again because you gave them a haircut and they are pissed at you and they don't trust you. That means these countries are not going to be sustainable, at least on our side of the world. Even though the debt is longer, but China will still trust you. And even when you're not done paying next year, insofar as they know you're still paying them the right amount, they will continue to give you another loan. Let's talk about the second case then. The second case is about the worst case for side opening opposition. In a world where you restructure your debt, right, and you prolong the years to 10 years, but you still cannot pay after the 10 years. So you basically tell IMF or China that you're bankrupt. Like, hi guys, like I'm so broke, I can't pay. Why is that still good for us? This is good for us because of three things. One, you are likely to go to HIPC. HIPC is like HIPC. It's an abbreviation for highly indebted poor countries. This is the thing that countries go to when they are so riddled in debt that they simply cannot feasibly pay. The IMF and the World Bank would all of your debts to external parties are going to be cancelled. You can only get that special status if they know that you are aggressively committed to paying the loans, but you simply don't have the ability. Do you know why GAFT is $1 million and you're giving them 700 grand and you're claiming you're doing a haircut? They wouldn't trust you. So even though you might be right in giving yourself a haircut, the external parties would perceive your haircut differently, so they won't be happy with you. So IMF and World Bank would not be incentivized to grant anybody HIPC status on OG or CG, and they're going to lose that status. The other thing that happens in our worst case scenarios is that you can even get debt cancellation. So you might not go to HIPC, but China can see you are operating in good faith and they could cancel some of your debts. For example, they've done this or several times. Like they literally reservice the loans by paying the interest, and when the interest are more than the principal, they cancel those loans. Those are all things they can do for you if they realize that you are negotiating with them truthfully and you are being honest about your resources, right? The third thing that can happen on our side in our worst case scenario is that even if you default on the loan and you're simply unable to pay despite a debt restructuring, it signals to the international community that maybe the terms and conditions of the loans were oppressive, right? That is literally how come the China Belt Road Initiative got called out by the Western world when they realized that countries like Uganda and like Eastern African countries are not being able to pay those debts that China gave out to them because the debt was simply unethical. China gave them too much money that they could feasibly pay back over a longer period of time. Do you know how they got to know about that? Because Uganda didn't just get up and say, hey guys, we're going to give you a 50% haircut, take this amount of money and we are going off, right? If they did that, the world wouldn't have known about the unethical terms and conditions of those loans that China was operating. That means in all instances, for you to get help as a developing nation when you are under debt, you don't need a quick patch by saying, hey guys, I'm splitting this into half, take 50%, take a haircut. No, that's not the way to go about it. Insofar as no GAF team can fiat that they would solve like the burden of debt 100% on their side, all countries are always going to be in debt. Our side is the one that ensures they can sustainably manage their ways around these. You've got to vote open opposition because we are the most realistic team so far. Vote us. Here.
I'd like to thank the speaker for that fine speech. And with that, we'd like to call upon the Deputy Prime Minister. Yeah.
Hello. Can I please ask for a minute? I really need to pee. I'm going to leave my device here so that you can hear that I'm going out to pee. Okay.
It's okay.
Sorry for that.
No, please mute. We don't want to hear you.
No, I'm just Hello, hello, hello. Am I
Yes, you're
still on?
audible. Yes.
Okay.
Yep,
Okay.
whenever you're ready.
My name is Matthew. Pronouns he, him. POI is through voice. I'll take one. If I still have time, just please don't badger. Please don't badger. Please stay respectful then. Okay. Wait. Okay. Starting my speech. Come on. Come on. Okay, no. Starting my speech in 3. Wait. Last clear. Yeah. Okay. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Just a simple line of response to all of OO's case from the get-go. OO fails because of the logical gaps, because they fail to weigh on why their options are better. Notice PM was able to tell you that the haircuts are also principally the same as being able to decrease interest because they're still cutting the collateral value anyway, but indirectly by lowering interest rate, PM was able to tell you that you're still not being pushed to lower credit score and lower trust in our side. Unlike what O unfairly posits, because frankly, a lot of these functions of haircuts are debt restructuring because haircuts are still negotiation anyway. Unlike in OO's misframe, assuming that haircut is from local government policy and not an agreement, you will never gain a haircut if your loaner country doesn't trust you. This is the problem of the info slide that assumes debt restructuring is different when you're principally doing the same. When you're principally doing the same thing, the problem in OO is that all of their benefits are still inexclusive. Those safety nets can still exist on government side because frankly, haircutting shows that you are committed to pay the loan, but if they're asking for the loan now, they need to negotiate lower than the collateral value. But if the case was just debt cancellation, then probably we go against the debt haircuts that essentially do the same thing, but earlier, but also actually provide ROI. But this is where OO falls, right? Because they just assert that a lot of countries are abused. So what? There's still no solvency on their end. In the world of opposition, you do not provide solvency for these developing nations when you do not alleviate them to uplift their own capacity to catch up with the pendulum of this international market or the IMF in the first place. Let's first make this less technical but easy to digest in the first place. What Kelvin told you is that the trade-off of unattractiveness to the other forms of investor is still non-exclusive harm on our side, but we are going to fix it. Simply, these developing nations are already placed outside of the emphasis of these investors in the first place for these structural reasons. One, you do not have economic leverage in the retrospect to begin with. Hence, the reason why they're still quote unquote developing. But the reason why we got haircut policy or we got this kind of reforms is because this type of nations or this type of relationship that you have right now is, something that you can bank on, something that you can trust to. Two, these instances are already expected by the investors, even absent the haircut policy that you opt to, because of the state of these nations in the first place. Three, if the problem is on long-term relationship with these investors, we say that we get that better. Simply, when you cannot afford to pay the overloaded amounts of debt, it is so much better to be honest rather than buying opposition's case, which overuse this overlapping amounts of debts in the long term. This is how debt trap happens, and this is how lots of first world country are being mad to third world country by overlapping their amounts of debt in the long run. Notice how this alone proves three things. One, the interest of loans will create a larger influx of debt. Two, the longer you force yourself to pay a debt that you cannot pay, the more debt you accumulate in the long term due to interest. The negative that you get from this is simply creates one, a worse image within the international community, within the IMF, when you have more influx of debt. Two, the longer time you put yourself in the bad optics of these international banks because it takes too long for you to pay in the first place. Notice how this already shuts down any possible material that you get coming from opposition when all of their case will fall under the same harm because of the capacity of these developing nations in the first place. Notice how their alternative, oh, there's still no alternative coming from them, sadly, is still not quite adequate from the capacity of these developing states. Notice how in every pandemic, every economic disaster, and any type of international tragedy, one of the first type of countries that are being affected are always in the bracket of developing nations. Problem, if their capacity is already hindered prior this emergency, imagine the economic disaster that they get once these problems arises. This happens in two folds. One, you will need more debt to survive, but you already have tons of prior debts. You already have tons of debts prior this. Two, there's no tangible investor that will come into you when it is already available in data that you have a low credit score, that you still need to pay billions and billions of debt that you still didn't opt to pay in the first place prior to this disaster. It is only in government where we can have the safety net of one of these problems accrue. I think Kelvin already told you how palatability runs for the scale of debts by creating a better credit score. It is only in our side where we get a realistic safeguard because all of the benefit that you get coming from opposition is fairly unrealistic. Where do you get the capacity to do that in the first place? This alone proves three things. One, it is only in our side where we can have debt sustainability. By reducing the amount owed from this kind of situation, the country at least get increased capacity to meet this debt service obligation. Their capacity alone creates a bounce back to make your country better and create a better GDP. So the problem in attracting investor is only realistically met in our side because their alternative they don't have any alternative because their side doesn't provide any realistic myths on this. They still they still do not say why they have the capacity to do this in the first place. Two, if debt trap is the problem, oh my god, it is intuitive that this is the main problem that haircut ought to fit to. And how does this manifest? A debt trap occurs when a country accumulates high levels of debt that it struggles to repay because they are dishonest of their own capacity to escape this cycle. Okay, I'll take the POI before that. Is it still time? Okay, I'll
Yeah,
continue with my speech then. I think it's time. Okay,
from closing
I'll take
opposition,
it.
we think that on both sides, given that you wouldn't be able to pay your debt anyways, and that is going to affect investor confidence and all that, we think it's better to resort to things like debt relief in that particular regard. That is what we try pointing out in PM speech.
Haircut is a debt relief. Haircut allows you to make you pay it earlier. It alleviates any tension in the international community that you cannot pay this, that you have this kind of data, that you have a low credit score in the first place. Because I think the problem in opposition is they do not understand how this manifests in the status quo because all of your alternatives is non-existent. All of the solvency on your end is still non-existent. You still don't explain how they have the capacity to do this. What is the other alternative to opt into? How they can accumulate this kind of credit score in the first place? Because notice how OO does not explain how do you break the cycle of debt trap that you experience right now in third world countries or developing nations due to them lacking the capacity to pay this in the first place because they're still dishonest that they can do this in order for them to protect their quote unquote image. So how does the haircut solve this? This type of implementation gets off any financial debt from the get-go by being honest on what is happening rather than prolonging the suffering of both sides, rather than prolonging the investors being turned off because you cannot pay it in the long run. Oh, when you flush amounts of impact, you still never explain how can they pay IMF, how can they repay China when you realistically do not have the capacity to do this. Trust is more realistically aligned when you effectively avoid overburdens, when the capacity to function is still available, and when you are honest within your side. By that, very proud to propose.
I'd like to thank the speaker for that fine speech, and with that, would like to call upon the deputy. Yeah.
All right, Chair, can you hear me?
Yes, you're perfectly audible.
Okay, please, can someone time me on the text space? I would appreciate if I am timed because I need to.
Is it possible for your partner to be posting timestamps for you, because I'm unable to check both timing and
Nana,
Mm.
can you put the time command? There's a time command, so just put it on the text space so that I'll use it to time myself. Great. That should be 7:15 though. Yeah, so POIs in the text space, I am going to prioritize taking closing government. But if you have any POI, just feel free to shoot. And I'm going to take you. Great. So I am going to be starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. In 2008, someone is, ouch, someone is muted or someone is unmuted. Please, can you mute?
Oh, sorry, I was just typing what you're about to say.
All right. Great. Resuming, starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. In 2008, the United States of America witnessed, or the world in global, witnessed one of the highest financial crises that we've witnessed over the recent years, which was somehow linked to the Lehman Brothers Association in America. Note, part of the reason why the financial crisis hit the way it did was because people lost trust in the system and its ability to revive their economic status or give them leverage, right? Note that because the Lehman Brothers held onto things like mortgage, right? The problem was that the financial industry as at then applied haircuts to most of the assets that were held by the Lehman Brothers. And when it unfolded, people realized that most of these assets, because they were applied haircuts, were not what their original stated or face value. The reduction in the asset values contributed to the significant losses for financial institutions like the Lehman Brothers because they invested heavily in mortgage-backed securities. What haircuts do is that even though I am going to make a concession in this speech with opening government that haircuts solve the issue the way they want it to, like the way they say it happens. The only thing you need to understand is that it is only on short-term basis, right? You're more likely going to mitigate the economic crisis of those states for a short time. We think it is important to analyze what happens on the long run, considering the nature in which most of these states operate. This is very crucial and very important. There are two things that we need to make clear in this debate. One, we need to come to a concession that debts are not so bad a thing, right? We need to come to a concession that it is totally okay for countries to be in debt, because no matter how rich, no matter how powerful you are, even the United States have debts that they owe at some certain point in time. So every country would always want to take so much more money than it probably have, just so that it can cater to the economic conditions of its people. The next thing that we need to make an agreement upon is that for developing countries, for instance, these countries are in a cycle of getting debt because to a large extent, their GDP ratio and the economic output from those countries means that they are less likely going to have a point where they would have enough money to be able to cater for all the things they want. It's true that corruption and all these things in those countries means that funds are diverted in different ways. We need to be able to agree that developing countries, because they are the primary actors within the framework of this debate, would always at every point in time need most of this money. What you got from my partner is the analysis to show that the only way we can have investors, the only way we can have people that lend most of this money to gain trust within the system is when they are able to know that when we give you loans, this is what is more likely going to happen, but we have a potential to get our money in the way we gave it to you. We think haircuts in itself make people lose trust within that particular system. The problem is they say, oh, there's no counterfactual. Opening government says there's no counterfactual on our word. We don't think that's true, right? My partner already clearly told you that we think that things like debt restructuring is better. And these are things that are more likely going to exist. With the info slide, we understand that there are a lot of alternatives that could exist, right? We think that it's possible for these countries to pursue other debt options, just like the info slide tells you, not limiting to defaulting, right, or debt restructuring. We say in the vast majority of instances that debt restructuring is something that is more likely going to make sense within that particular framework. But more importantly, what we showed you in the leader of opposition speech is that you protect trust between you and the people that have given you this loan. But more importantly, the worst case scenario where restructuring doesn't work is even more favorable on our side, because you can have things like debt cancellations, but it also signals that the loan was probably unethical and probably a debt trap, the way that China does with most of these countries. We think this is something that's very easy to understand. But more importantly, they say that at the end of the day, you're more likely going to make things worse for these countries, right? Or you're more likely going to make things worse for investors within that particular framework. What exactly do we think makes their word very, very terrible? There are two things here. One, we think at the end of the day, there is long-term repercussions that exist. So while haircuts might be able to provide short-term relief, we think they are not able to address the underlying issues that have caused the high debt levels of those countries. This is important for two reasons. One, so that we don't continually have an argument of, oh, these countries are encircled, they're encircled in debts, they're in perpetual debts in themselves. We think it's important that you're able to address why exactly these countries always have these debts in themselves. We think that is what you get on our alternative. When you do things like debt restructuring, you're more able to understand what exactly causes these countries to have these high debt levels in of itself. We think that without comprehensive economic reforms, these countries would struggle to achieve any form of sustainable fiscal management in of itself. But secondly, what the award does is that it reduces the credit worthiness of these countries, these developing countries in themselves. How? Because aggressively pursuing haircuts would negatively affect the credit worthiness of the developing country in of themselves, because lenders become more hesitant to provide future loans or demand higher interest rates, making it harder for these countries to access capital in the international markets of themselves. But lastly and more importantly, if you have to do things like haircut within those particular narratives, it means that things are more likely going to be so bad for these people. In extension, we need to look at the internal issues that are more likely going to happen. Haircuts would also mean that you affect internal state owings too. I am sorry, I think I am out of time. Before I would look, time was up. Yeah. So like I was saying, we think haircuts means that you affect internal state owings too, right? A perfect example is citizens who own things like T-bills and pensioners. We think they would also have to undergo haircuts at the end of the day. This means that it affects the trust the citizens have in the state's financial machinery. Why is trust very important for the sake of this debate? One, because it is the only way that developing countries can be able to guarantee a form of repayment when they take these loans. But secondly, it is the only way the people are more likely going to have trust within their system to know that things are more likely going to be better for themselves. At the end of the day, investors also incur losses on the diminished value of their investments when things like haircuts happen at the end
a lot of concessions in terms of like the policy making decisions that you have to necessarily have. So first of all, like your spending decisions are necessarily scrutinized. How much you're necessarily able to spend on certain things within your budget are necessarily taken away because of this. And most countries' sovereignty is taken away by the IMF. That's why a lot of countries necessarily have also taken loans with China. But what we're going to do on our side specifically is show you why necessarily asking for haircuts on both contexts is more better than debt restructuring, as is the counterfactual that they've necessarily done. Let's talk about the IMF here, right? So one, we necessarily think that the loans necessarily the IMF necessarily come up with are inherently predatory. We think that one, you necessarily have to give up concessions on how you necessarily spend money, abuse of your sovereignty in the first place. But you can necessarily say, well, you necessarily need to do this to be able to get more money. Why does this necessarily become worse necessarily when you do things like debt restructuring, right? The problem is, right, anyway with debt restructuring, you need to pay the loan after a long period of time. So this can be like 30 or 40 years. The problem necessarily then becomes, one, interest necessarily accumulates, and the idea that you're necessarily going to be able to pay the debt in the future is relatively it's very hard to do, specifically because you're a developing country. So you can't necessarily spend the amounts of money that you necessarily need to promote things like economic growth, because the IMF is necessarily looking at how necessarily you're spending your money in the first place. But then they necessarily say this to mitigate this, and then they say debt forgiveness necessarily exists. Debt forgiveness is not accessible. Why is debt forgiveness not accessible? Because most of the concessions that the IMF necessarily give are very difficult to. So, for example, if you necessarily need to reach economic growth, but at the same time you necessarily need to be able to pay off your debt, it becomes very impossible to reach those unattainable goals. And we see this because most countries' debt hasn't been forgiven in the first place, and that's why most countries have necessarily moved towards China in the first place, right? But secondly, debt restructuring necessarily becomes bad within your domestic policies, because most people within the media, like domestic narratives, necessarily become like, look, you're asking for more loans from the IMF, but the IMF has already given us predatory loans and stuff, right? So why do we necessarily keep on loaning from the IMF in that sort of state? So social unrest necessarily will also increase within these developing countries, and that's why most of these countries necessarily have veered off from the IMF anyway. We think when you ask for haircuts, it's necessarily principally better because we're able to pay a loan much more sooner. But secondly, you're able to necessarily have a better relationship with the IMF, because if the IMF necessarily concession for a haircut in this sense, the narrative behind the IMF necessarily becomes better within these domestic countries, which is something that's more valuable, specifically if you're trying to make policy decisions specifically about your budget. But secondly, let's talk about China, and this is something that's particularly important here, right? So can I take it, please, quickly?
Yeah, right. So if you don't pay the full amount of the principal, the person that gave you the loan cannot reinvest to get enough money to give you back some more money when you go next year. Like, don't you see you're harming yourself if you're not paying back in full?
I think also with debt restructuring anyway, if you necessarily also have to make a concession that you can't necessarily ask for more loans in a short period of time anyway. So like, I think it's going to be difficult. They're not going to trust you with giving you more money, because the idea here is you're trying to solve your debt problem here, right? So I don't really understand why it necessarily becomes a incredible problem here in this sort of thing. I think it's a better concession to necessarily make. You make that concession as well in your case, implicitly. Secondly, in terms of the extension, right? Loans with China are necessarily predatory for one reason, is because they necessarily use your resources as collateral. Why is this necessarily bad, specifically for developing countries? Because one, usually you're using natural resources like land as collateral. Secondly, you're also using government securities that usually are used for like pensions and loans for these individuals. The problem is when you don't pay off your loan, specifically, you are never going to be able to, you necessarily give up these resources away, which is something that's very important in today's debate. Because in the idea of debt restructuring, the idea of collateral does not necessarily go away. This collateral probably will still be used. And I've already given you structural reasons why the Global South will not be able to restructure their debts anyway, even in these contexts. But the problem necessarily here, and an exclusive impact necessarily from closing government, is that, look, in a sense that you lose your national resources and your securities, most likely your citizens are not going to like it. They're most likely going to riot. And in this sort of sense, your things like protecting like your currency in terms of like your government bonds when you necessarily have to pay for these sort of loans. You're losing natural resources that can be necessarily used to build more housing. Or the fact that you might lose people's pensions within these loan agreements is something that's particularly impactful, because at a point in which you have social instability, these things necessarily impact your economy anyway, and you necessarily are likely going to veer away investors from investing directly into your country. With haircuts, we're most likely able to pay that loan because necessarily we have a lower principal amount in the sense, and we're able to solve for that in the short term. Even their side necessarily understands that time is necessarily an important thing to necessarily be able to repay this debt. You are fucked anyway on both sides. We're better on our side. Thank you.
We'd like to thank the speaker for that fine speech, and we welcome the member of opposition. Yeah.
Hello. And please, am I
Yes.
audible? Like,
Yes.
all right. All right. So I'll be starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. So let me just rehash what the comparative has been so far in this debate. So the motion is about developing countries which are poor and they have low levels of economic development. And the fact is like they should deal with their large debts that they owe to other countries or institutions. And these debts are often used to finance projects and like that are supposed to be improving the living standards and growth prospects of the developing countries, such as infrastructure, healthcare, and education. However, sometimes these debts become too burdensome and unsustainable, meaning that the developing countries cannot afford to pay them back without sacrificing their basic needs or compromising their future development in that particular regard. So the comparative in this debate is between the benefits and costs of haircuts versus all other debt options for the developing countries and their creditors. Now, here's the interesting about this debate. Gav is supposed to prove to you that haircuts is the best as opposed to all other debt options that developing countries have. From up, we just need to prove to you that haircuts isn't the best. What that means then is that even if we single out one debt option that beats haircuts, then it means then that it's like we win this particular debate. And that particular option that we think that developing countries should be resorting to is what we try to point out to opening governments for a very fair debate, so that you don't say that we try to skew the debate from closing opposition. And that is the idea of debt relief. Like, why are we going to argue this? Because I think it settles bulk of the debate in the open.
Hello. Okay. I'd like to confirm if I'm audible to everyone.
Yes, you are. You are audible.
Okay. Can the partner just communicate with let me just send something. Can you just communicate with them that they're not audible anymore? Let me just take them in the chat.
Cut is a debt relief. That's sorry.
Sorry.
Is it okay?
Sorry. I think you're gonna need to like. I couldn't hear like most of your speech. The last thing I heard you say was how if you're able to single out an alternative to haircuts, then you do good. So I think you need to go back like.
Please, one's mic is open muted.
Paula, do you mind muting yourself?
Okay.
Okay. Sorry.
Yeah.
Remember, I was still saying that I couldn't hear you from like. I don't think I heard much from your speech really. So I think you're gonna have to start afresh.
It's not in the hawk. Abana more affecting video anything.
Hello.
I get to people go a browser it's Kibela
Hello.
like to because hey chance. Get table X. Oh, nakin tite. I can't see go.
I want to go home. They are still
Okay.
yeah,
I just get feedback from the partner, perhaps, on like what's going on.
yeah. That I around the document. Average.
Okay, kita sampai kamu. It's not nice. On both sides, it's not nice.
I'm thinking it's better now. So, Judge, please, may I hear what you were saying?
I was just saying, like you were just at the beginning of your speech. The last thing I had to say was, if you're able to if you pick out a single alternative to haircuts, then you do better. So I think that's the last thing I had.
Oh, okay. So that's like within my first minute, right?
Yes.
All right. So then I'll continue my speech in 3, 2, and 1. So basically, what I was saying then was, just in case you are better able to even prove to you that there is one other option that beats haircut, then it means that it's taking why haircut is really bad. Feedback is bad.
Yeah, but I'm still getting issues.
Hello.
I'm not sure if it's someone who's on. Let me see. Let me mute them again. All right. Can you just try speaking again? I had to like save and mute 2 people, so could you just like keep your mics muted from where you are for the convenience of the other speakers? Thank you.
All right, awesome. Can I restart my speech? Is that possible?
No.
Or is
Yeah,
that too
that's
late?
okay. No, it's
All
okay.
right. So I'll start my speech. All right. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. So let me just get straight to the conversation. I think the and cost of haircuts versus all other debt options for the developing countries and their creditors. What then is the most interesting thing about this debate? What Gav need to prove to you is that haircut is the best option for these developing countries as opposed to all other haircuts from up. We just need to prove to you that haircut isn't the best option, debt option. But that means then is, even if we are better able to prove that one particular other debt option is better than haircut, then it means we beat government in this particular regard. So opening opposition tries to talk about debt restructuring. What we actually wanted to talk about is debt relief, which we shoot to the opening government in order for us to have a fair debate about the comparative between debt relief and haircuts in that particular regard. Why are we going to run this particular extension? Because I think it settles a bulk of the debate in the opening half, and here's why. Which says you won't be able to pay your debts in both worlds anyways, and that's true to an extent. We will be proving that to you from our side, even though they don't prove to you that. What that means then is so hard to prove why developing countries would better be positioned to pay back their loans just in case they engage in debt restructuring as the alternative to haircuts, which I think they never did. What we will prove to you then is why debt reliefs make them better off and better position them to grow economically and even be in the position to pay off any other debts that they are owing elsewhere in that particular regard, right? So when we talked about the fact that we are defending debt reliefs, DPM says, haircut is a debt release. I think that's total nonsense. And here's why. Like, there is a big difference between haircut and debt release, right? And here is the difference. Haircut simply is you begging the creditor to decrease the nominal value of what you actually were loaned originally. So in case it was $10, now they are decreasing it to $8. Debt release literally has to do with the idea of like the idea of canceling the debts totally for these particular developing countries. That is what we are going to defend as the most feasible thing for developing countries to do, and why that makes them better off in the
Speaker, we lost you again. Hello.
Colonization and its impact. During things like colonization, in the vast majority of these particular
Sorry,
countries,
sorry.
what's happened
Hi,
is colonial masters,
member.
yeah,
Yeah, I lost you again for like I don't know half a minute.
about what?
I lost you for about half a minute or so. I'm not sure. You were just getting into the point on why you think debt relief is better for these governments.
All right. But am I very clear, or there is a break in in what I'm saying now?
You're very clear.
Oh, awesome, awesome. All right.
Right.
So
If you,
continuing
I
my
don't know if you could maybe just keep your eyes pinned to the chat space if it's possible, because I'll just signal there if at any point in time I cannot hear you.
all right, then I'll look in the test space, and I would
Right.
really appreciate just in case you put in when I reach my third, fifth, and seventh minutes. I hope that's gotten, so I would continue. All right, continue my speech in three, two, and one. So why do we think that developing countries are in a poverty trap, and hence they are likely not to be able to pay off those huge sums of debts, those huge sums of loans that they have already owed, like that they are already owed to several big companies or institutions? Sorry, big institutions like IMF and countries like China and etc. Due to the impact of colonization, that is one make for this. Because during colonization, you had most colonial masters extracting a lot of their resources, such as oil, gold, etc., which they largely depend on, like during this particular time period. What does that mean? It means then that post-colonization was much more difficult for governments to necessarily to have enough resources within these particular developing countries to run them. But steadily, there was even much more difficulty in trying to practice the new form of governance, which was democracy within these particular systems, because most of these developing societies operated on things like chieftaincy originally or monarchical systems in that particular regard. So things like accountability of leadership, even that in vast majority of instances too, you had people not being so well educated to hold them accountable. But most importantly, post-colonization, you equally had things like ethnic wars emerging within this kind of economies. And it means then that chaos have literally been transcending in most of these particular economies from time immemorial till now. What is the problem of these things? These things are the reason why it has become more difficult for these countries to have some kind of sustainability in terms of development. It means then that they literally started the whole idea of civilization from a negative standpoint within this particular, within the world in that particular regard. It means then that all other developed countries were far ahead when these particular countries decided to start building themselves up in that particular regard. This particular historical incidences have transcended to status quo, and it is the more reason why it has become much more difficult for these particular developing countries in the vast majority of instances to be able to achieve that kind of stability which they need in order to be like developed countries in that regard. That is the reason why it is much more difficult for them to be fixing the problems that they face, even if they are borrowing lots of monies and all those kind of things due to mismanagement, as I've told you, due to the fact that they are usually not familiar and not better off with this kind of system of governance that were imposed on them post-colonization, and due to the constant conflict within within these particular countries in the vast majority of instances due to what do we call it, the kind of boundaries that colonial masters set for them while they were living these particular countries. Why then do we think that debt release are better for them? Because notice, debt release is a debt option that involves canceling the debt by the developing countries to their creditors, such as other governments or international institutions. Debt relief is usually granted on things like humanitarian grounds, which we think these developing countries are better able to be a beneficiary of, just in case they decide to pursue debt relief in that particular regard. Or the incentive for the debtor to implement economic and social reforms is also one reason, is also one basis on which debt relief is actually better. Given this, that is how it is literally different from haircuts in that particular regard. we literally then prove to you why debt release make these particular developing nations better off. Why? Because it reduces the nominal value of the debt, meaning the
Alright.
amount of money that the debtor has to pay. Like this can literally free up more resources for what do we call it, the debtor to spend on their development priorities such as infrastructure, health, education, or climate change, resilience, and all those kind of things. The reason is because we are talking about a situation where these particular debts have been cancelled in and of themselves. And please, panel, I would really like to appreciate when I reach my fourth and my fifth minutes. Like, sorry, my fifth and my sixth minutes. I think I've not been seeing anything in the test. So I'll just continue. What does this mean then? It means then that the debt release now gives them the capacity to improve the debt sustainability, like the debt sustainability of the debtor of this particular, i.e., these particular developing nations, meaning their ability to repay their debts without compromising their growth and development is something you achieve in our world. We are not just going to be giving you abstract analysis. I think these are some of what do we call it? Some examples, what do we call it, of countries that have benefited from debt relief under the heavily indebted poor countries, which is the HIPC, their initiative, and the Multilateral Debt Relief Initiative, which is the MDRI. I think one country you can talk about here is Ghana. Like Ghana literally reached its completion point in 2004 and received 3.5 billion dollars in debt relief under the HIPC initiative, an additional 4.2 billion dollars under the MDRI. What is this to say? Like literally, Ghana used the savings from the debt relief to increase its spending on health, education, and agriculture, and to achieve like what do we call it, a lower middle income status and the millennium development
You
goals
alright?
between 2000 2019. What this resulted to then is that Ghana's GDP per capita increased by 180%. Its poverty rate declined by 24%, and its human development index improved by 18%. Because notice that the idea of haircuts on their side is one that still pressurizes these kind of economies to necessarily settle that particular loan. It means then that there is still pressure for you to utilize almost all the financial resources that you have to settle this kind of debt. On the comparative, debt release is the idea that your loan has been forgiven you. We have cancelled this particular loan for you on the basis of humanitarian grounds. Why are they likely to achieve this particular requirement to achieve this kind of debt release or grants? We should know how they are like
You
they have
alright?
been suffering right from the time of, I think it's in protected time, right from the time of colonization, and how, like, what do you call it? There are more people that are suffering due to things like wars and displacement and etc. within this particular kind of instances. It means then that they better fit the context to be this kind of grants just in case they pursue them in that particular regard. But this equally beats open opposition, because given that we show you how when they are better relieved of these particular debts, it means that the little resources they are having, they would now be able to better utilize them in investing them in their infrastructure, in their health, in their education, to be better off, just like what do you call it? A few countries have been able to achieve in that particular regard. We've never been this proud to oppose.
I'd like to thank the speaker for that fine speech, and thank you for that speech again. We'd like to call upon the next speaker. Yeah.
Hi, am I audible?
Yep, you are.
Okay, cool. Thank you so much. My name is Zuki. Prefer pronounce he, him. I prefer my POIs in the chat. No, in verbally. That would make much better sense because I won't be looking at the chat space. But give me a second to set up my notes and my timer to ensure that everything is fine. Okay, cool. Okay, I'm gonna start my speech in 3, 2, 1. Panel, two things that you need to note in here. First reason why so closing government is winning is because we're able to fulfill two duties of this type of motion. Firstly, we give you a principled analysis on why this is something that's worth doing by giving you the idea of self-defense. Secondly, pragmatically, we are able to show you better outcomes, but more so something that like profits the people on the ground more than it actually does anything, because we think that's the first point of obligation for these countries. Second thing then that's important, if you want to do this thing of like examples, because that's literally what opposition is trying to have, an example debate. Before I get into like grade, like we responses for each bench, I'm gonna just speaking like on an example. I think Zambia as an example, post COVID-19, they defaulted because they reached at least 110% of their GDP was all debt. The issue then here is when they were able to do such a thing as like haircuts, you think they were able to then restructure their debt to be able to have one, more control over it, but secondly, they were then able to have some form of economic growth because they were able to redirect funds much better so that they can be able to pay off the loan. But lastly, here's the great thing: they were able to have better credibility because then haircuts don't happen arbitrarily, even if they happen aggressively, based on negotiations. And anything that opposition is trying to tell you was like it's a random thing and they just like do haircuts, we think that's something that's dogmatic, and please don't take them at their best. Nonetheless, let's do what we have, not what we get from both benches. Then let's start with opening opposition. What's the issue then with opening opposition? Three things that you get from them. One, they want to tell you that, hey, we want to increase the level of trust. Secondly, they give you the counterfactual of saying that we want the HIPC, like, because that's the better counterfactual. One things like debt relief, because that's something that's great, right? Fine. We think that's not an issue. We'll deal with it anyway in terms of just like how everything else is done. Firstly, let's deal with the idea of level of trust. Two responses to this. Firstly, you need to note then this is something that's like, if we were to take them at their best and say this is something that happens on their side, look, like as we say, haircuts do not happen arbitrarily. This is negotiation based, right? This is to say, when a country wants a haircut, it literally has to be in negotiation with their creditor so that they can be able to have a reasonable ground, like a reasonable form of restructuring of their debt so they can be able to pay it off in a good way. This looks like South Africa being able to be on the table with like at the IMF to be able to like negotiate how much of debt they had, how much haircut they, like how much cut of like the devaluing of their debt they need to do. That means two things then happen. Firstly, there's an open line of communication, and that's something that instills some form of credibility. Secondly, you are able to get things like fiscal responsibility, and that's something that you get from my first speaker, which is says that you are able then to gain some form of level of trust anyway, because it's not something that happens arbitrarily, and that's something that's important. Secondly, then let's deal with the counterfactual of this idea of the HIPC. One, they're trying to sell you roses and feathers to say like when you go to the HIPC, then you're going to be able to pay off your debt and it's going to be fine. Look at the inconsistency here. They say that the reason why they don't want haircuts is because then you don't want to remove the credibility from your creditors that you can't pay back stuff fully. Then in the same breath say, hey, we want to go to HIPC and be able to relieve our debt, and that's something that's fine. Note then here, we think on a comparative, it's much better in a world where a creditor is still able to regain most of their funds as opposed to a world in which they're not able to regain anything at all. We think comparatively, we are still better. Second thing then here, you still get from like my member of government, the idea that it's important then to note that like these countries also have to like have some form of economic stimulus for their own people. That's to say, it's important to have one, first control over your debt, but first of all, secondly of all, like your assets are very important. This is going to be something that's important when I show you why we win in this debate. Lastly, then, in terms of opening opposition, this idea of short-term basis. Firstly, we think this is untrue because your debt is better managed at the point in time in which you're able to have better control of it. We've given you analysis whatsoever when we say like at the point in time in which you're able to negotiate like basis for your debt, we think that's something that's much better for our side. Secondly, we think even in an instance in which this is true, we think in a world in which you still indebted into a point whereby you can't even fund your own education in your own country because the IMF said they want their money, we think comparatively we are still better on our side because at least there's some form of time we still get some form of economic stimulus that gets in from our side. You're gonna get much more when I explain why extension wins in this debate. Lastly, then let's talk about like closing does. We think firstly, closing opposition is very derivative of their opening because all they want to tell you about is that this debt relief. But secondly, this is a problem with debaters using Google statistics to kind of like justify their cases. Two things then here. We think at the point in time which we are going to argue that debt relief is something that's good. Firstly, we already everybody in this room except closing opposition understands the importance of why we constantly need loans, why we constantly need debt to exist. Two things that exist here. Firstly, you don't get a loan again when you do things like debt relief. That's the reason why concessions that have been given by my member of government tell you that you are less likely to receive a loan again in terms of short-term basis because of the concessions that exist within the IMF. You are unable to become like a person who's trustworthy. Secondly, then here is at the point in time, even if you do get that loan, you're most likely going to default to countries like China. That's what my member of government tells you. That means the loans that you even get aren't even going to be able to be something that is beneficial towards you. That's why the loans are inherently predatory. So you're most likely feeding developing countries more to the vouchers themselves. That's very important. Lastly, then, even in the instance of debt relief, we think at the point in time in which countries like Zambia, literally at the point in time in which they apply for things like debt relief themselves, we think the creditors panic and want to get their loan back. They don't deal with that idea where creditors are going to be like, hey, let's just relieve them of debt, right? And they're like, that's fine, even if we're not going to recoup our money. They don't deal with that type of instances, which is something my member of government speaks on extensively. Lastly, then, no, actually, I'm not going to deal with this idea of Ghana because we think that's like just like a weird example to use. Then let's tell you why we win in this debate. We think that something is particularly important. 2 points of contention here that existed. Firstly, sovereignty. Secondly, on the idea of credibility. Note, just on a point of technical debating, we win this debate because we give you a principle of self-defense, but pragmatic outcomes that are much better on our side. 2 points of contention. The idea of sovereignty. On opposition, what you get is a world in which you are most likely going to default. Even if you don't default, you're most likely going to get a world in which, like, when you get your debt relief, they're going to want to hold your assets against you. What do you get on closing government exclusively? 2 things. Firstly, we tell you we want to trade off our own assets. We don't want a world in which our assets are going to be used as collateral and are going to be taken. That means we remain slaves forever. Secondly, we say we want to have a bit of control over our debt. Even if it's not fully, we think that comparatively, when we are able to have better control over debt repayment, we are able to control the inherently predatory debts that everybody agrees are inherently predatory. Lastly, then, very quickly, is the idea of credibility. We say on closing government exclusively, negotiations open a line of communication. That means a form of fiscal responsibility then exists, and that is why you get better credibility on our side, because the responsibility is something that creditors actually like much better. Lastly, we tell you that, hey, HIPC is just not going to give you this access to this debt relief. Member of government already deals with you on how developing countries and don't have access to this enough. Very proud to propose.
I'd like to thank the speaker for that fine speech, and with that, we'd like to welcome the Chief Whip. Yeah.
Clearly more logical, but they are not considered. Am I audible? Hello.
Yep, you are.
Okay. So I'll begin my speech in 3, 2, 1. So panel, I'm going to do 3 things in today's debate, and basically this is how you should judge the debates. Which side of today's, which bench, which team helps you understand how developing countries can sustain their debt? Which team provides you a more plausible solution in today's debate? And which team has ensured to you that developing countries, when they take one initiative, will not fall into a debt trap in the long run again? And that side is CO. This is why it is true on a number of reasons. One, on the issue of plausible solvency, my partner helps you understand how Ghana went to HIPC and was forgiven, and its debt was forgiven. There is a reason why the ex-president of Ghana, John Agyekum Kufuor, during his era, there was a reason why the cedi to dollar was 1 cedi to $1, which had never occurred in the history of the country before, despite the fact that the country was highly indebted, because he did something no one prior to him or before him had done. He did something we've proven to you in today's debate is plausible. He went to HIPC, he filed a formal complaint to help them understand how Ghana will not be able to repay a debt, so they should forgive Ghana. Why did they actually agree? Because one, these people have an incentive. Realize these the G7, the G20, these economic superpowers have an incentive to actually help these developing countries, because for most of them, they know these developing countries are suffering structurally because of colonization, because of the exploitation they themselves are enacted on them. During the pandemic, right after the pandemic, Saudi Arabia forgave most African countries their debt through the issue of just debt relief, right? It means they will not be paying any debt to Saudi Arabia or paying anything to Saudi Arabia. Why is this very important for developing countries? And my partner characterizes for you. It's because these countries need this money to actually be able to invest it into their own economies. They need it to be able to possibly build their schools and their hospitals, their roads, in order to boost their supply chain network. They need it to be able to improve the standard of living of their own citizens. Why does this weigh over our opinion? It's because our opinion tells you, oh, they would actually enter into a negotiation, then they will pay some of the money. We tell you, you will pay nothing at all. We've proven to you it has happened before and it can happen again. Why do we beat the government? Because the government primarily helps you understand the fact that, so right, CG, the government specifically tells you that you don't get loans when you do debt relief. This is why it is not true. It is because currently Ghana still borrows right after John Agyekum Kufuor, Professor Jonathan Amos, John Dramani Mahama, Akufo, all of them borrowed money despite the debt relief President Kufuor engaged in. This is something that has happened in status quo. This is a plausible solution we are offering you, and this is not a Google fact. This is something, it's my country, and I know it, and I'm telling you. Panel, why is it important that you consider this in today's debate? It's because of the concept of developing countries. My partner already told you, Gav has to prove why haircut is so paramount and why we should do it. We've already helped you understand why, even in the haircut, a few things would happen. One, when you do the haircut, there will be lack of trust, as we will analyze this to you already. Trust is in the heart of financial institution. So trust is in the heart of financial institution. So it's very paramount that regardless of what happens in the status quo, these people know that when you come back again, you'll be able to repay their debt. Right. So I've already proven to you. Then again, on sustainable development, which like sustainable debt management, whether it is haircuts, right, or whether it is the defaulting that O tells you about. In either case, the haircut is worse because you will not be able your debt to continue to accumulate in the long run, and you will still have to repay that particular debt. You're a developing country, you can't do it. But why is OO's solution still not plausible as ours, right? Because even if the cut even if you enter into this default restructuring and you are supposed to pay just a limited amount over a long period of time, right? We still think you are going to pay. We still think the debt will accumulate. We still think it's bad for developing countries. We still think it's going to put so much burden on their economy. We provide you a simple solution. We say you will pay nothing. We say we've proven to you a tried and tested solution. Panel, why should you buy into our argument? Right. Because even if you think Ghana is an exception to the rule, the reason why Ghana is not an exception to the rule is because of the example of Bolivia, right? These people engaged in the HIPIC initiative, right? And like years after, the economy is still improving. We've proven to you it can happen. Like it's not as if it's not a tried and tested means. This is something that can happen, and this is something that would happen in status quo, right? So panel, realize one simple thing in today's debate, right? These developing countries have gone to borrow money. They are already highly indebted. They are highly indebted. What that means for you is that they need a solution, a means that would actually, when they actually engage in that means, it will not affect them so much. CO is the only team that has engaged all the teams and proven to you why the debt relief is better than our openings. Is better than our openings of alternative, and we've proven to you why it's still better than everything the Gov bench tells you about. OG, 1,
Okay.
2.
Not only debt relief is an unrealistic option for all developing country in 21st century in comparison to haircut, it is also unstrategic. You also piss off non-state creditors like IMF, even worse like OO, and make your credit score shut itself. Not everyone is in Uganda. Not everyone is, state creditor.
So I don't know if you actually said it is unstrategic. I've already proven to you how Ghana actually enacted it and it's worked, right? And you use the example of IMF, and not all of them are state creditors, right? We think even with these international monetary funds and the World Bank, they still have an incentive to actually like engage in this debt relief program, because basically you file a complaint to tell them, like I've already structurally told you how Kufuor did it and how it worked for the country of Ghana. So I really don't see how it is unstrategic. And realize we are the only side that in our world we don't accumulate we don't accumulate debt in the long run and in the short run. Our debt is forgiven, and we are able to actually reinvest it into our economy in the long run. And this is able to help each and every single person in this country, despite the fact that we are issue of colonialism and exploitation. So they know that these